biology, the name is evolution. In mathematics, it's called incompleteness. In physics, it's called, quantum indeterminacy. In politics, it's called democracy. In psychoanalysis, it's called the unconscious. And then in Christianity, it's salvation. It's Christ crucified.
Between belief and unbelief, faith and doubt, certainty and uncertainty, there is space. Each of us is thrown into this place to love, to ache, to rage, to heal, and to experience the wonder and the mystery of being. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the wonder and the mystery of being. Thank you for joining me. Today features a conversation I had with Peter Rollins, who's an Irish philosopher and thinker, author, speaker. Really, really interesting guy. I have to admit that he's influenced my thinking a lot. And so when I had the opportunity to interview him, I geeked out a little bit, and I think you might actually hear / if you're watching this on YouTube, you might sort of see me sort of stumble over myself a few times because I was trying to ride this fine line between asking questions that I've wanted to ask him based on everything that I've read from him, but also having a conversation that's useful to you all who maybe don't know as much about him. And so I was trying to ride that fine line. I hope I did a good job. So before we get into this conversation with Peter, I kind of wanted to give you a thought that can help guide the way that maybe you'll listen to this. Sometimes when we're talking about concepts that are very abstract or maybe, on levels of analysis that we've never contemplated before, sometimes they can sound like straight up nonsense. I can't tell you how many times when I've been studying like maybe a great philosopher or a great, psychoanalytic thinker or something like that. I've read their stuff and been like, this is nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. It's totally full of contradictions. He says this thing and then he says this thing, and they don't seem like they can both be true. But as I live with it and, maybe read other thinkers in that same vein, or maybe sometimes I'll listen to a podcast about a great thinker or watch a YouTube video about a great philosopher. And sometimes that can bring a little clarity to like, oh, when they say that, they mean this. So some of the stuff we talk about in this conversation sometimes requires a little bit of digesting. You kind of need to sit with it, think about ways in which two seemingly contradictory things might actually be able to be true in some sense. I love this topic because I actually think even though it can be very philosophical and analytical, it's also super practical because it causes us to sort of come to grips with the fact that we encounter contradiction in our lives all the time. And part of becoming a healthy human being is learning how to bear that. So with that little story and preamble out of the way, please enjoy my conversation with Peter Rollins. The first thing I have to say to you, this is just a full admission of my own, I don't know if it's a stereotype. It's a stereotype I'm not even getting correct, I don't think. But the first exposure I ever had to you was on Rob Bell's podcast. And when I heard you talk, well, the first thing obviously most, North Americans would notice your accent. And the entire time I was listening to you speak, I was picturing Desmond from Lost.
Which one was I watched Lost from start to finish, but it was a while ago. Which one was Desmond?
So Desmond was the one that was already on the island that had to push the button, right? Now, I think Desmond was Scottish. So, I know Irish and Scottish.
Well, we're pretty close because I'm from Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland and Scotland are both geographically very close and also have a very similar, some cultural and linguistic similarities. So,
my sister married a Scot, and for the first year that I knew him, I didn't understand a word he said.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. A deep Scottish accent or a deep Northern Irish accent, I would be able to understand, you know?
Yeah, yeah, he's I mean, he's from Glasgow, so it's
Oh,
like
yeah.
very thick. But anyway, so that was, my first experiences with you were all like, I was picturing, this guy that's been on an island for years and years and just has tapped into some sort of level of reality that was not available to me up until this point.
I looked a little bit like him for a while. I don't know if you ever saw the Rob Bell documentary, but
I did.
In that, I look crazy because when I first moved from Ireland, like I had really long hair, looked a complete mess, and never really thought about it. And then I saw myself on film at times and I was like, oh my goodness, do I look like that? And if anybody ever watches that documentary, Heretic, you'll see I look like I've just been dragged through a hedge backwards. And I completely forgot about the interview. So I showed up late and I was like, do I look okay? And the guy said, yes, the director, but his hair was even crazier than mine. So he was the wrong guy to ask. Just brush it or something. So yeah, I probably looked like Desmond for a while.
Yeah.
But I've up because I live in Los Angeles and you have to try to look presentable in this place.
That is so funny. Well, yeah, the first, I mean, I have learned so much from a number of the different ideas that I've heard you talk about and write about. Probably one of the first ones that really blew my mind was the various ways of conceptualizing God. Super being, hyper being, ground of being, and then sort of God as event, but the ground of being one that rocked me. And by the time anyone's seeing this or listening to this, they will have been introduced to that idea already, so we don't have to cover it. But that was a huge idea. When I read The Idolatry of God, that book of yours really helped me see a new way of conceptualizing God, and the way that I had conceptualized God in the past, potentially as something that was an idol for me. And you talk about object A, which is the thing that we all believe will make us complete. And that's something, I mean, the year that I lived in LA, I had an experience that brought that to the front of my experience, because that was, as a songwriter and a musician, that was the year I had my first big #1 song.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So you had the success, you got the thing, you confronted kind of getting the fantasy. And how was that?
It was awful.
Yeah. Yep.
It was honestly, it was one of the worst weeks of my life. And for a few days, I didn't have the ability to articulate why. I just knew that I was miserable because I was consumed with these thoughts of like, what now? And am I going to get the credit for this, or are people going to credit my collaborators? And it was these ugly thoughts that I was even aware of. And I'm like, that's gross. Like, I'm not proud of that. But as I thought about it more, I was like, okay, well, it's two losses, because it's a loss of a goal, something that I had to aspire to that I no longer have to aim at. I've lost my thing to aim for. And it was also a realization that the thing that I thought would make me whole and complete was never going to be able to do that.
Yes. Yes. It's the experience that people have if someone's an obsessive and they're collecting all of these magazines, and it's like there's 100 of them and you've got 99, and then you get the 100th magazine and you slip it in, and then you realize, oh, the lack wasn't in the magazines, the lack's within me. I externalized the lack. So it's like when I was a kid, there were sticker books and you had to collect all the stickers, and they had to make it difficult, because the moment you completed the sticker book, there was this kind of maybe a brief moment of followed by the reality that the lack that was within the sticker book is a lack that is actually within myself. So yeah.
And I mean, I've heard you mentioned elsewhere, oh yeah, go for your dreams. You should absolutely go for your dreams, so you can be horrified by what happens when you get them.
Yeah, absolutely. Fulfill your dreams and realize they do not fulfill you. Yeah. 100%.
So, so you've talked about this thing, and forgive me for bringing up something that I'm sure you've spoken about a lot, but I would love to try and address it in a way that hopefully is unique. So if there's aspects to it that you feel like are fresh for you, feel free to dive into like new aspects of this idea.
Well, yeah, although, I'm going to say one thing on that, because that's beautiful that you say that, and I appreciate it. But the truth is never stale. Now, I'm not saying this is the truth, what we're talking about, but if we touch on the truth, if we somehow touch on something that is meaningful, that kind of reveals the world in some way, then I could talk about it forever. And and in fact, like I don't know, you probably know the work of Slavoj Žižek, maybe a little bit, or maybe you've heard I've talked. Like, he's written like 50 books. He's so incredibly prolific, but he'll say himself that he's just written the one book 50 times. Like, he repeats, but his repetitions are so fertile that they feel new. So don't worry about going over old ground. I love this stuff. See what you want to talk about? I am right there with you.
Right. So what I want to cover with you today is that it's a jumping. We could use that sort of what the story I just told about having a number one song and having it be totally unfulfilling and dissatisfying. We can use that as a jumping off point, because what I'd love to talk about is these sort of fundamental contradictions that we run into when we go deep enough into absolutely anything. And this feeling of like lack that we all experience, that we're trying to fill. And you talk about the secret of the lack.
Yes.
And that is something that just has been super helpful for me. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of expanding on that idea for a minute.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you could say that, all of us in any frame of life, in any worldview, any religious or non-religious worldview, we can experience a sense of dissatisfaction. I mean, that's what desire is. Desire is a sense that I want something, and without getting too deep into the weeds, there's desire for a cup of coffee, which is very kind of basic desire you can fulfill. And then there are desires that the more we pursue them, the bigger they get. Like, the more money you get, the more money you want, or something like that. Or the more number ones you get, the more you want, or you want a different type of success in the music industry. And they're called drives, right? We have these drives that are different from instincts. Because the weird thing is, right, you look at an animal has instincts. An instinct has a number of things. And an instinct is discrete. It's connected to mating or shelter or food, right? So it's discrete. Secondly, it can be fulfilled, right? Once a bird makes a nest, that instinct is satisfied. And then thirdly, instincts are in the service of life. They bring homeostasis to the animal that allows them to die naturally. I mean, if you kind of think of instinct as a way for an animal to not die in a way that is external to their own biological system. Drives are a bit different. They feel like instincts, but a drive can be for anything. It can be for food, but then it will be for too much food or too little food. Or it can be for shelter, but then it'll be, I want 2 houses, 3 houses, extensions, But it can also be for gambling. It can be for stamp collecting, anything. So it's not discrete. Secondly, they don't get fulfilled. The drive is something that no matter how much you give yourself to it, you always want more. And the failures generate more desire, like the gambler who's always losing and gambling more. And then thirdly, the drive can be in the service, not of life, but of a form of death, a form of destructive repetition. So we have this experience in our lives. And we want something to fill it, to get rid of the contradictions, to get rid of this, to kind of find this peace. And we fantasize. Like, fantasy in its basic coordinates could be said to be a type of your kind of theater, the kind of film that you make that you think will bring satisfaction. And we fantasize certain things and we want certain things. The problem is we're unhappy if we don't get the thing that we want, And then we're devastated when we do.
It's even almost worse when we do. Yeah.
Yes, there's a more existential dimension to it. So it might not be more physically painful, but it's more painful to one's subjectivity.
Yes, it's like painful on a deeper level, on a level we're less familiar with and less capable of handling.
Yes, absolutely. And so you get things like, that Nexium or whatever, this group that was in LA, that kind of appealed to a lot of quite successful people. What you notice is like the more successful these people are, that often the more like they're looking for success, they're looking for the thing that will fix, and then you end up getting involved in something very peculiar, right? Very weird. So I see this all the time. So we try to fill this lack. And religion, obviously, in its confessional form, is just like everything else. It's just like the New Age practitioners and all of that. They're promising wholeness. It's like the world is a massive vending machine, and everybody's got their different product in the machine that will fulfill you. What I'm interested in is not putting your money in the vending machine to try to get the right product that will satisfy, whether it's yoga, whether it's drugs, whether it's religion, but rather getting a sledgehammer and smashing the vending machine. So it's a different logic of desire. So I can't even remember what you were asking me, but I know it was something about this, what this sense of lack is and dissatisfaction, and how we want to fill it. We don't want to confront it.
Yeah.
I'll say one more thing on this, right? Sorry. And then
please do.
So like psychoanalysis is a great example. So one of the areas that I'm really interested in is psychoanalysis.
Me
particular
too.
form. Yeah, structural psychoanalysis. Fascinating. Glad to hear it. Right. Now, the difference between psychoanalysis and counseling, psychology, depth psychology, those kind of things, is right. When you go to an analyst or a therapist, something is going wrong in your life. Lacan, the psychoanalyst and philosopher, says that basically the cure, but what he means by the cure is, what helps us live well, live deeply, live in a way in which we are not at war with ourselves. So the cure is a demand that is articulated on the lips of a person who suffers in their body or their mind. And so in other words, you go to an analyst because you've got symptoms. Something's going wrong in your life. You keep self-sabotaging. You keep breaking up relationships at the wrong time. You get annoyed with people for no reason, whatever it is. You can't leave the house. You can't stay in. And what we want to just get rid of the symptom. We want to get rid of I can't digest food properly. There's something that my body's not functioning right. I think it's a stress, something in my mind, right? I want to get rid of that. Now, in psychoanalysis, you don't get rid of the symptom, you listen to it. The symptom is the name for a contradiction in your being. If you can't digest your food, sometimes it's a physical thing, but sometimes it's because you cannot digest a trauma from your past. There is something indigestible, and it comes at night in the form of terror. So, people who can't sleep at night because there's a sense of like this terrible presence that then is concretized in a stranger in the house or someone under the bed, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the point is that in bad therapy, you try to help the person get over the symptom and get to a point where they're not maladapted to the world. In psychoanalysis, what they do is they try to create productive maladaptation. They go, the symptom is a contradiction. You're grinding your teeth. It's because you want to shout at your partner and you also want to keep your mouth shut because you don't want to lose them. Right? So you've got ambivalence. And as you understand the contradiction, you don't reconcile it. Then it goes to a deeper contradiction, which is you wanted to shout at your parents when you were young, but you also were scared to. You were terrified of doing that. So that's a deeper contradiction. And then you go to an even deeper contradiction, which is just the nature that we are a trauma, that life has these antagonisms. And the cure in psychoanalysis is not that you get rid of the contradictions, but that you symbolically identify with them. You're able to work within the contradictions that you are, that you realize that you love and hate somebody, that you want to be with someone and you don't want to be with them, that you want to shout at someone and you don't. And you realize that you are those contradictions. And when you embrace that, you experience a deeper sense of life.
Yeah. Yeah. And that can be seen in some of the things that, we have this desire, we fulfill it, and then it doesn't do the thing that we were expecting that it would do. And
Yes.
we're confronted with the lack, right? Like, we're confronted with this void that has not been filled by the thing we thought was going to fill it. And we hate being confronted by this void, right?
Yes.
But everything that I've read from you and others, that's been sort of the thing that's been helpful massively is for me going like, okay, I am going to have this sense of lack. I'm going to have this, in Christian terminology, we'll call it a God-shaped hole, right?
Yeah. Pascal is brilliant, actually. Yeah. Anyway, keep going. Yep.
But I'm going to have this my whole life. So rather than trying to fill it with all these things that never really seem to be able to do it, I'm going to have to learn to bear it.
Yes,
and
because you know what? Because potentially God is the whole. That's the thing. There's this Russian sect that where they, instead of worshiping icons, they would cut a hole in the wall of their house and they would pray to the gap itself. So instead of God being that which fulfills the gap, what if God is the gap? Anyway, but we'll get back to that, but keep going.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah.
We are, by the way, this is our demand is the same as the demand of the old joke of the Buddhist who walks into the pizza shop and says, make me one with everything, right? That is the demand that we all make of the psychoanalyst and the priest, right? When you walk into church, make me one with everything. Take away the lack, make me whole and complete. The original demand of the devil, the serpent, right? The superego. Because the superego is always the thing that says you can be whole and complete. You can be like God. You can lack the lack. And we try to obey the serpentine superego voice. So we make the demand, make me one with everything. And we who work in the pizza shop have to resist that demand.
Yeah. Oh, man. Okay. So I want to bring in something that I heard you say somewhere on a podcast. I can't remember where. And also, I think it's in some version of this is in your Twitter bio. I think it's when someone asks you what you do, you say, I dish out existential despair for cash, or some version of that.
Yes. That is my money-making approach.
Well,
Not Bitcoin, it's despair.
Right. I love that because in my process of re-examining the beliefs that I grew up in, I grew up in an evangelical Christian background, and when I started examining or re-examining those beliefs and finding things that I was struggling to continue to believe, I mean, existential despair does describe it well.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, like, am I going to hell? Or maybe that's not even a thing. Does that also mean heaven's not a thing? If none of those are things, then what am I doing here? I had always been told that my purpose here was to glorify God and to bring more people into salvation and a relationship with Jesus. And does that mean what I used to think it meant? And what if none of that is real? And I started going to therapy because I was so distraught about all of these things. And I started diving further into the Bible and going like, oh man, there's some problems, big ones. And I had recently become a father as well. So I felt this pressure to understand reality so I could pass on my understanding to my kids. Did you ever have, well, first off, I'm under the impression that your background was within Christianity. Is that the case or is that not?
No, not until I was 17.
Oh, okay, so that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I entered into it when I was like late teenager, and then stayed within kind of confessional Christianity for a time, and then kind of got into radical theology from that.
Right. Was there ever a moment for you or like a season maybe, where the beliefs that you adhered to, at least for a time, began to come apart? And was that distressing for you?
Now that did happen, but funnily enough, not in the same realm as yourself, right? So for me, I came into Christianity late, and my experience of Christianity, while a very profound one, was a sense of not so much something being added to my life, but rather something being subtracted from it. So I experienced this idea of subtraction from my cultural, political, religious past. I kind of felt this experience of like the oscillation of ideology. So I kind of suddenly was just felt no longer in the world briefly. However, where the crisis was for me, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I want to show that it happens to different people in different ways. Absolutely. And the one I'm going to describe is probably as big, if not bigger than your one, which is in the realm of relationships, right? Romance, right? Todd McGowan, a very great thinker, he writes in his book, Capitalism and Desire, there's a chapter on love, and he makes a distinction between love and romance. Romance is basically the notion that you want someone else to fulfill you, to be to make you complete. You complete them, they complete you. You pass the finishing line. The romance movie, it's all a struggle to get to that point of the unity, and then the movie ends. And of course, it always ends there because it can't end half an hour later when they're arguing about taking out the trash.
Exactly.
So the romance movies always end before love starts, because love is whenever you realize that the two of you are incomplete together. But for me, I think I often sought in relationships when I was young, this fantasy of either me completing the other completing me. And my great trauma was encountering the crisis of romance. And that was the great challenge that I had to overcome to get to a better place. So for some, it's like God is the romance. I mean, even and you've been in the Christian world, there's these songs that are romance songs to Jesus. They feel like Jesus is your lover.
And that was very much the version of Christianity I grew up in. It was very I remember hearing the phrase a lot. It's not religion, it's relationship.
Yes.
Which I can see from my parents and their generation, that idea was actually freedom for them, because it felt so much more free than this very strict, orthodox, rigid version of Christianity. But for me, growing up, and a lot of people I know my age, growing up in this idea of it's not religion, it's relationship, that was a thing that became a burden to sort of conjure. It's something that you had to sort of conjure up in order to be a good Christian.
Yes. And I want to argue the exact opposite. Yeah, I want to argue it's not relationship, it's religion.
That's where I'm at. Yeah,
exactly. And I'll tell you a parable that I think captures what I mean.
Well, okay, hold on. I interrupted you though. You were about to tell me about your trauma. So hold on to the parable and forgive my interruption and tell me about your trauma.
Yeah, so the trauma was really the move from romance to love, the death of experiencing and wanting wholeness in some sort of relationship, which, by the way, sounds horrific, right? The death of romance sounds horrible, and it is, right? This is, this just to explain dialectics very quickly, because it really gets to the heart of this. So dialectics is, Plato said you should not be introduced to dialectics before you're 30 because it's very complicated. So stick with cause and effect and all of that, and then learn dialectics later on. But dialectics at its core, and I'm just going to give you how it works, not the theory.
Sure.
Sorry. Dialectics is a form of a position generates its opposite. So you have a position, and then you find the contradictions within that position, and you think that the opposite is external to your position, but then you discover that it's part of it. And in that discovery, you move to a third place. Now, dialectics is a weird thing because it kind of works in dualisms. It works in there's a not at oneness. You experience the world as dualistic, which we all do in everyday life. Now, when we do, we try to either in our heads go, everything is one. So we try to reduce the dialectic to oneness. Or we try to choose the best path. When you've got two options in front of you, you try to choose the best one. Dialectics always chooses the worst. So whenever you've got a choice between light and dark, you go to a therapist, you go, my life is really dark, I'm really depressed. You help me get rid of my depression. Well, what does the analyst do? They push you even further into the dark dungeon of your despair, right? So you have to go into the darkness. If you've got a choice between life and death, we want to choose life, choose death. That's the kind of love is about a death of yourself and then you find life. So you go into the darkness and you find the light in the darkness. You go into death, you find the life in the death. You've got a wide path or a narrow path. You want to choose the wide path, you choose the narrow path. The narrow path leads to the way where the wide path doesn't. So that's dialectics in a nutshell. Is weirdly that you have to go into the despair, the darkness, the what's called the death of God in philosophy. But weirdly, as you go into the heart of the darkness, into the dark night of the soul, into the cloud of unknowing, that gives birth to the very thing that you think you've lost. So for Paul Tillich, for example, you go fully into doubt and unknowing, but then eventually by fully embracing that, you discover a type of knowing in the unknowing, right? In other words, you kind of like, you find a certain kind of, like if an artist is never able to paint something beautiful, right? Every time I try to paint, it never captures it exactly. But then I realize that, I am kind of caught up in the beauty that I'm trying to express. It's already kind of guiding me. So I find myself standing in the very place that I cannot articulate. Or the lawyer who's always trying to be just and never can be fully just, right? The justice system always has to be rewritten. But that very passionate pursuit shows that they are caught up in justice. It's the notion of, that verse, ask and you will receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be open. We read that as cause and effect. Knock, you wait, the door opens. Ask, you wait, you will receive. Like if I lose my watch and I look for it, I find it. No. It's asking is receiving. Seeking is finding. Knocking is the door opening, right? There's no, it's like heat is light, right? There is a certain sense in which your pursuit of the truth is the evidence of the truth manifested. It's almost like you don't argue to the truth, you argue from the truth. And then you try to articulate what that is. That's what philosophy does.
Right. And there's a challenge there, because sometimes when you're articulating it to someone who hasn't sort of maybe processed a certain issue along those lines, it sounds like nonsense, right?
Yeah. Sounds crazy.
Right? Like I've tried to explain this to a few friends, because for a while I got to a place where, just to put sort of a spiritual journey aspect to what you're talking about, I was in a place for a while where I was like, well, I don't believe in God anymore. Like God, it just, there's way too many logical, rational issues, scriptural issues, all these problems. I don't believe in God anymore. And yet I go to a Coldplay concert and I feel like I'm more connected to something really, really big and ancient. And I went skydiving one time, and I had this bizarre experience where I realized that as I was floating in midair, I was experiencing silence for the first time. Because everywhere that we go, we're inundated with the air conditioning, the traffic down the street. And when I was suspended from a piece of fabric, a few miles in the air, there's nothing to make noise. And I just felt this transcendent, like, I'm touching something huge and ancient and mysterious, and I don't know what this is. And at the time, I would have said it was God, but what does that even mean? And so I came to this place more recently where there was all these experiences in life where I'm like, whoa. There's something there. But the more I try to name it, the more it seems to sort of slip away. And so the journey I've been on more recently, and this is why I'm calling this whole thing The Wonder and the Mystery of Being, is that I may have lost my belief in a certain idea of God. But if we talk about God as the ground of being, that from which everything arises, that which sustains it all, being is something I've been in this whole time.
Yes.
And it's like, I think about that. I don't remember exactly I'm going to butcher this verse, but it's, surely God was here and I was not aware of it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm seeing now. And everything that you're talking about, it ties in with that so beautifully.
Absolutely. And something that we mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
which you may or may not use, but I mentioned to you Gabriel Marcel.
Yes.
Yeah, he's French. He was a French existentialist who, one of a fascinating guy, wrote a lot of plays. He wrote so mostly kind of in piecemeal form, but he wrote this beautiful essay called on the Ontological Mystery. But one of the things he writes about beautifully is a description of what you're talking about. And the reason why I mentioned it to you is because of the title of this podcast
Yeah.
and YouTube channel is he makes a distinction between problem and mystery. He says a problem is something that you stand outside of and you look at. So if I'm a scientist or whatever, I'm looking at something objectively as possible, and I try to address it. He says, when I treat something as a mystery, I am subjectively interwoven with what I'm looking at. So I'm not looking at something separately. My gaze, my look, my subjectivity is woven into what I look at. And so when he writes on the ontological mystery, he's developing out of Heidegger, actually, a type of philosophy. He's an existentialist.
Okay.
So this is existentialism, but existentialism is a type of philosophy in which you realize that you are within what you question. Then when we question what the nature of reality is, the nature of thought and being, it's almost like it's not that you're thinking about the universe. You are the universe thinking about itself, right? That's Hegel's great insight. Now it takes him, one of the most difficult books that's ever been written to be able to articulate this.
Yeah,
but
Hegel's really hard to wrap your head around. So I mean, Heidegger as well.
Yes, so these are all difficult thinkers, but when they talk about mystery, like when Heidegger talks about mystery and Marcel, it's this very sense in which it's almost like, and I'd say you've gone the journey you're articulating it's a perfect analogy, an object lesson in this is because probably when you first kind of embraced Christianity as a thing that you believed, right, and then you maybe embraced kind of atheism in the sense of as a belief about the world which you embraced. What happens when you start seeing yourself as the universe thinking about itself is you stop thinking about, I can look at the world objectively and kind of make decisions. You almost start treating the world more like a dream, like a psychoanalyst treats a dream. If you tell me a dream, I don't think, is it true or is it not, right? I'm a fundamentalist. I'm a literalist. I believe it's all true, right? I believe your dream is telling me the deepest truths about your subjectivity, your fears, your desires, your contradictions, right? And we analyze that. And as we analyze that, the truth of your being and the truth of your environment becomes obvious. It comes into words. So in a similar way, when you read something like Gabriel Marcel, you kind of start not by going like, can I look at the world objectively and talk about existence or non-existence of fairies or something like that? You start and go, what do I believe? What do I dream? What do I desire? How do I construct the world? And what does that tell me about the world? What does that tell me about myself? What does that tell me about my desires? What does that tell me about the moment in history that I'm in? It's a slightly different way of going about things, but it is treating the universe as a mystery rather than a problem. And by the way, Gabriel Marcel doesn't just say, you can choose one or the other. He says that mystery is the philosophically sounder way of interacting with the world. When we treat it as a problem, we make a fundamental mistake.
Oh, that's so good. When you were describing that, I was actually thinking about relationships, like romantic relationships, or marriage. And, when I get into an argument with my wife, for instance, I have a choice to make. I can either argue with her on the grounds of trying to determine who's right and who's wrong, or I can switch my thinking and go, she is explaining her experience to me. She's telling me what it's like to be her. Doesn't that matter more to me? And won't I be able to I'll be able to find a healthier resolution if I approach the entire thing from assuming like, hey, it doesn't matter if I actually said this thing or actually did this thing or whatever. Yeah. What matters is she is experiencing this and I love her. And so I care about her experience more than I care about my right to tell her that she got it wrong, right?
And there's a truth. It's like what Hegel says: the real is rational, the rational is real. And what he kind of partly means is that everything speaks truth. Now, that doesn't mean we understand what that truth is. We have to analyze it. But for example, if someone thinks, I mentioned earlier, someone thinks there's an intruder in the house, right? Now, we all think that maybe occasionally if you hear a noise. But if someone has what could be called like a psychotic anxiety in which they are certain that there is an intruder in the house every time they're alone, right? It's not a doubt, because the difference between a neurotic anxiety is there's doubt. Psychotic anxiety is it's absolutely certain there is an intruder in the house, right? So now that's true. Now, it's not true that the intruder, like there's literally an intruder. So we can talk about that as a problem, and that's our everyday cause and effect. That's great. But if you stop there, you miss everything. So like, no, the intruder is in you. Just like whenever a child thinks there's a monster under the bed, no, the monster is inside them, but that intruder is inside you. And if you take something like Winnicott, psychoanalyst Winnicott, in some people have a fear of a breakdown. They feel that there's something that is going to kill them, either physically, like an intruder, or they're going to disappear in their ego. Their sense of self is going to dissipate in depersonalizations, for example. And they're terrified of a trauma that's going to happen. But you discover that actually that's a fear of a trauma that has already happened.
Yeah.
That hasn't been able to be subjectivized. And so the good news for someone like that is the trauma's already happened and is over. The problem is you haven't been able to digest it. You haven't been able to put it into language. Just very quickly, there's a guy, Bion, very, very good analyst. Yeah, he talks about, at first it sounds complicated, but there's a beautiful way to use this language. He talks about beta elements and alpha elements and alpha function. Okay. So to explain them very quickly, a beta element is when you're a kid, for example, something happens to you. It might be horrific, or you experience it as horrific. It might not be, but you hear your parents argue, but they're not really arguing, but you thought they were. But whatever it is, some trauma happens and you can't put words to it. You scream, like you see kids having temper tantrums and stuff. They literally can't articulate the too muchness of life, right? There's an experience of too muchness of life.
I've got 2 toddlers, man. I'm with you on that.
Oh yeah, you can see the too muchness of life, the terrible twos. Is that what they call it?
Yeah, so, I think it's also the terrible threes, and I have one of each. So.
All right. Oh, very good. Yeah, and imagine it. It's like it's a too muchness of life. And by the way, that articulates the psychotic experience and the autistic experience that are pretty much very similar, but because you have this too muchness as you go on. Now, for Bion, what you need, and you as a parent, you provide what he calls an alpha function. The alpha function is the child screams at you and has a temper tantrum, whatever. You contain it. So you take on all of that stuff, you contain it. And then you feed back what's called alpha elements. You put it into language. You help the child gradually over years, articulate their too muchness. I think you're angry because of this, or you're just, you're working, whatever it is, you start to put it into language. So what you do is you alpha-beta-size their experience, because you make their beta experience into an alpha experience. So you alpha-beta-size, which means, you help them be woven into language, into the symbolic realm. Right. And this is profoundly healing. That's why in psychoanalysis it's a talking cure in many ways, because you're alpha-beta-sizing the past traumas. But you can only get there when you realize, the terrible fear that's stopping you from sleeping, that everything's falling apart, is a truth. It's not. So that's why it's stupid to say to someone, there's not an intruder in the house. Yeah. Right? And you also don't say, the intruder's inside you. But you simply use that to go, this is telling a truth about something that we can begin to explore.
Yeah. I mean, that touches on an idea that I got from Jung, that you can't really begin to sort of be quote unquote good until you gain a recognition of how awful you can be. Yeah. It's like until you identify and come to grips and confront the monster within you. I'm the monster. I'm the intruder. Yes. I'm the one that people should be afraid of. I'm capable of horrible things.
Yes.
Until you come face to face with that, you can't hope to live in a way that somewhat approximates a good person, right?
Yes.
And I actually spent a good amount of time really resenting the idea, the very idea of sin, or the word sin, because I've seen so much damage done to people in Christian culture by this idea that we're inherently sinful and bad and awful, and that damage is real. So I'm not taking anything away from that, but I did find some sort of redemption, not even redemption, but a reclamation of the term and the idea of sin in some of Carl Jung's work, because I went, oh, there is an element of, I need to confront the evil in me.
Yeah. Now here's an interesting thing. A couple of things. One is we should definitely pick up on Jung again, because my one of my close friends is Elliot Morgan, who I do a podcast with.
I'm familiar.
And he's studying Jung now, and it's funny because I'm quite critical of Jung, but it's going to make a really interesting podcast. So we're both excited about this. So we might come back to Jung.
Sure.
But I also want to pick up on the idea of sin, which I love, because here's my thought on sin.
Please.
Is the reason why it's damaging is dialectically, the church has not realized how sinful we are. It has to go deeper. It pulls its punches. Now, what I mean by that is, even in the most, even in like Lutheran and Calvinist communities, which embrace supposedly original sin, right? This idea of original sin, they don't. They're more like progressives. They're more like people like Matthew Fox and others who actually embrace original blessing, right? So, and this is my problem. They don't go far enough, and that's where the damage is. So basically, someone like Matthew Fox says, actually, it starts in original blessing. There's a wholeness, there's a completeness to everything. Then there is a fall. So sin is not original, right? Sin meaning lack, right? There's a fall into lack. And then there is a return to wholeness, right? Now, even people who embrace, I think Luther's a very interesting figure, actually very radical figure, but his radicality I don't think is embraced. There's an original blessing, there's an original wholeness. Now, if you take the term original sin and just as an original coming first and sin just meaning lack, right? Original lack, or in philosophical terms, ontological incompleteness, right? Like in physics, incomplete, or in mathematics, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, ontological incompleteness. For Gödel, mathematics is logically incomplete. It cannot complete itself with its own axioms. If you take that as meaning that, right, then it means that lack comes first. To be like, so we think this, right? We think that, oh, I'm one with my mother, for example. I'm one with, like, when I come out of the womb and it's all great, and then I get separated from my mother, and then it's a bit of a nightmare, and I want to go back, right? That's the Oedipal thing, right? Is Oedipus wants to sleep with his mother. That's a symbol of wanting to go back to oceanic oneness, going back to the womb. He kills his father. That's the prohibition that separates us, language that separates us from the mother other. Oedipus goes back, sleeps with his mother, thinks it's going to be wonderful. It's a disaster. That's the whole thing of fulfill your dreams so that you realize the abject horror of them, right? You get the oneness, you realize it doesn't work. So you've got that notion. But actually, the truth is more complicated. It's not that you exist before as one with the other, and then you're separated. You are the separation. To be a subject is to experience a me and not a you, an inside and outside. To be a subject is to be like Swiss cheese, is to be infused with gap, with nothingness, with lack. Almost like mathematics, when it draws a circle and that's zero, it draws a circle around the lack, and then the lack becomes something, right? Subjectivity is a type of circle around a lack. We become who we are through a sense of lack. So here's my thing is, in confessional Christianity, lack, sin, is seen as not constitute, it's not original, and therefore can be overcome. Now, here's a funny thing. Within confessional Christianity, the answer is there, right? If I'm in debt, that's a lack, that's a nothing, right? I'm in debt, I owe you $1,000. Then someone pays it. that lack is filled. The lack of money is filled. And debt makes me have to do jobs I hate, all of that, right? Forgiveness of debt is different. If I owe you $1,000 and you forgive the debt, you don't fill it, but you render the nothingness nothing, right? There's a lack, the nothingness, the debt, which is, so there's two types of nothingness.
Yeah.
Debt's a nothingness of something. So you render the nothingness that is something, which is debt, into a nothing that is nothing, which is, you say, don't worry, you rob the nothingness of its sting. My argument is we're always trying to fill this lack we feel. We're always trying to find something that will fill it. What we really need is the experience of forgiveness, which simply means not, oh, you did bad things, it's okay. It's the sense of, oh, I don't need to frenetically try to fill a lack in my life with children or drugs or this or that, because it's that very frenetic pursuit that breeds anxiety, destruction, monstrosity. And rather, grace is the freedom from that frenetic pursuit.
I literally want to take it. I mean, I wanted to and did just take a deep breath after that. Because, now we're speaking to the culture of the day, right? Like,
yes,
things.
Yes.
I remember when I was a kid, things did not move this quickly. And now things move very, very rapidly. And technology has enabled us to do amazing things in shorter amounts of time, with the idea that, like, we'll have more free time now because the things that used to take up this much time now take up this much time. But what we did instead is we just added more things. And as a result, like, we are more stressed out than we've ever been. We're more anxious than we've ever been. And you know, getting back to existential despair, it's like, well, yeah, that's the whole deal. And you know, for people watching this and listening to this, a lot of the people that I get the chance to engage with are somewhere along this journey from Christianity to atheism, and then sometimes questioning what's beyond that. But there's this whole journey, and you said it earlier, that's so accurate. It doesn't look the same for any two people, really. Before we started really recording, you mentioned that you don't feel like Christianity and atheism are opposites. So I wondered if you could expand on that.
Yeah, not at all. So to take the word Christianity out for a second and say theism and atheism.
Sure, yes, that's better.
Start there, but this will make sense. Is people think that theism and atheism are opposites, and that they either tolerate each other or are outright enemies. But the truth, if you study this, is actually theism and atheism have always been in a dance. They've always enriched each other. And not even just enriched each other, they are overlap each other, almost like a Mobius strip, right? Theism is atheism, atheism is theism. And at first someone goes, what does that mean? Right? What does it mean?
Like, what would you say? Like, what would you say to someone who responded to that with, like, well, that's nonsense. One of them has to be wrong. How would you respond to that criticism? Okay, well, to look at, so I do a thing called Atheism for Lent, yes,
which
I love it.
And explores this interaction over Lent. We read 40 great critiques of religion as a spiritual practice. You take some of the earliest atheists were the mystics. So atheism means the rejection of a theism. There's lots of theisms and there's lots of rejections of theisms. So atheism and theism have this affirmation negation. One nominates, that's theism, nominates, and one denominates, that's atheism, denomination. And it's interesting that churches are called denominations. But so the mystics would say, for example, every time we name God, we have to dename that name, because what we're saying isn't what we're referring to. So our words are always wounded. They are a theopoetics. They are an attempt to not even name the world. For the mystics, sometimes it was like a response to an event that we feel caught up in, that we can't articulate. So a mystic or a philosopher who's influenced by mysticism, like Jean-Luc Marion, talks about a saturated phenomenon where you feel like it's like looking at the sun and going blind. And so you're we're like a ship in the depths of the ocean, right? Sunken ship. The ship contains the ocean contains the ship, but the ship contains a fragment of the ocean contains the entire ship. And so the mystics embraced a very profound atheism. Like they literally said every theism has to be negated. And actually in this dance of affirmation and negation, which we all have to do, eventually a path opens up into what's called the Way of Eminence. So again, they were dialecticians. They always picked atheism over theism. They said, and the Lord's Prayer starts, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." So God is named as Father, but hallowed means holy, which means separated, not what you think, right? The transcendental. So immediately it's denamed. The name Father is denamed, not like you think of Father, right? So now that's the most basic form of how they dance. They dance it really interestingly together in contemporary world, in the work of someone like Slavoj Žižek and the work of Hegel before Žižek. But you start to say, oh my goodness, that actually whenever atheism and theism are separated, atheism becomes this adolescent cry of rebellion, right? And theology becomes this type of astrology, type of absolutely, superstition.
Yeah.
But when they come together, they enrich each other. So if you look at people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Paul Tillich, these are theologians who are profoundly atheistic. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, you must live as though God does not exist. Only when you live as though God does not exist do you find yourself living fully before God and with God. Right? So again, at first you go, what does that mean? He wrote this in prison before he died, but he articulates it. He says, to give yourself to the world in love is to find yourself immersed in love. And as Marguerite Porete says, I am love, says God. No, I am God, says love. She has this beautiful line that says, I am love, says God. So Bonhoeffer basically says, God is not an object that you love. God is the name of a depth dimension you discover in the act of love itself. So you can't love God, right? You can't love God as an object. God is not an object, but rather in love itself, a dimension of depth and reality is opened up that transcends atheism and theism and also touches on their heart. Because what is the heart of both of them? Kind of, in a sense, to get to the heart of justice. A lot of the best atheistic critiques, so Freud critiques the God who we believe because we're weak, the God who makes us infantile. Every time we're scared we're going to die, right? We bring God in. And then, therefore, God appeals to the worst in us. Like, what about the person who is courageous enough to face death and doesn't care? Well, they don't need that God. What about the person who doesn't have to feel guilty? Because I look at my shadow, I look at my darkness, I confront it, I wrestle with it. I don't need to escape it, right? Then Bonhoeffer says, what do we do with the people who are mature, right? God, that God wants to make us into infants, or the God of the gaps. Right? Yeah. Nietzsche, the God who we just wheel in whenever we don't understand something. What about the person who embraces mystery and says, of course we don't understand everything and I don't need to wheel an answer in, And so whenever you look at Bonhoeffer and Tillich and others, you realize that's they profoundly embrace that profound atheistic critique, and yet do something theological with it. So that's how they dance together.
And and you may sort of, I had this sort of experience lightly studying Nietzsche because so many of these really brilliant philosophers, I've had an easier time understanding by studying other people writing about them, because sometimes for me studying them directly is challenging because I'm like, oh, this is really hard for me to wrap my head around. But one of the things that I've looked at in Nietzsche is that the story he tells of, the famous sort of like God is dead and we have killed him story. Yeah. And I did read that one directly and some commentaries about it. And I went, oh, like Nietzsche was onto something and totally not the thing that I was always taught. Like growing up in church, it was always reduced to like, that kitschy thing where you'd see on a billboard, like God is dead, Nietzsche. And then it would say, Nietzsche is dead, God, it's like, we got you. But when I read that God is dead thing now, I see that he was longing for something beyond. He was hoping that humanity would be able to reach for something beyond our need for the God that we had sort of created. And we discovered that, like as humanity, we're waking up to the idea that God that we imagined, that God that we conceptualized, maybe that God is not there. But like, how do we get beyond the lack of that idea that forms when we get rid of that God or we lose that God?
100%. Who was Nietzsche critiquing? This is what people forget whenever they read that.
He was not critiquing the religious.
Yeah, no, exactly. He was critiquing atheists.
Yes.
He says, you don't realize that God is dead. You have no idea. So it's really interesting when you read it and you go, oh, this is a critique of atheism, where he said the lightning is struck, but you haven't felt the thunder. You don't know what the death of God is. You have a new holy people. You have a new mission. You've basically got what's called a political theology. You've taken these theological terms and you've created humanism. Nietzsche was profoundly against humanism because humanism was all about the individual being able to be whole, complete, being able to be in a, if you look at some of the old humanists, like a state of nature, like a type of completeness. And Nietzsche was Nietzsche was saying, no, that's just the notion of confessional Christianity, the human. And so he's critiquing that because he goes like, no, you have to realize that we've loosed the earth from its sun. We don't know where we're going. The compass is withdrawn. I mean, Nietzsche is very much into this notion of we have to embrace the contradiction that we are. And the other thing people don't realize is how religious Nietzsche was. One of the most religious philosophers ever lived, He was so pious in his youth, and when he went mad, he kept signing his name, the chosen one and all of this. So, Nietzsche is profoundly misread by every 15-year-old he picks up, beyond good and evil. Nietzsche is a profoundly interesting theological figure.
Yeah, I've been super fascinated by him, partially just because of what you just said, how my early understanding of him was so wrong. Like like it's almost exactly the opposite of what he was actually saying is what I always sort of thought he was saying.
Yeah. It's like that with great philosophers. It's almost like you have to misread them first. So with Nietzsche, it's like I did the same. The first reading of Nietzsche is the opposite. You read him as a nihilist, or you read him as a humanist, or you read him as an anti-religious thinker, right? That's the misreading. But then you have to do the misreading to get to the right reading.
Yeah.
And it's the same with Freud. It's the same with Hegel. Is most people's first reading, it's the opposite. It's interesting how Nietzsche is seen as the humanist, nihilist, kind of anti-religious philosopher, when you realize he's an anti-humanist, kind of like in the sense of he's critiquing this kind of the sovereignty of the human that's created, and he's profoundly trying to embrace this notion of the death of God. Where does he get the death of God from? Well, from Luther. Where does Luther get it from? The Gospels, right? This notion of the death of God is this profoundly destabilizing event that's actually very central to Christianity. But confessional Christianity, I think, balks at it.
Yeah.
Right?
So to bring all this back down to like a how we live our lives, ground level sort of place.
Yes.
For people that are going through this process of questioning their beliefs, whatever beliefs they once had that they are doubting now, and coming into sort of this new way of maybe thinking about God, if they still feel like there's something, but they're trying to walk out this journey. And I know, like, I'm speaking for myself here. Most of my friends are still Christian. My family are Christian. And I realize I'm using a label right now, which is one of the things that I've found profoundly unhelpful in this process is terms like Christian and atheist. They never seem to totally work for me. But what kind of advice would you give on a practical level, people going through this stuff? Feeling disoriented, feeling like they've lost their way in the world, or that maybe that like they've come unmoored from something that they no longer feel like they can put their faith in, but they don't know what else to turn to. What would you say to like someone who came to you in that space?
Yeah. Well, can I answer that by going back to, remember I was going to tell that Jewish parable?
Yes, please do.
Religion over relationship.
Yeah.
But because I think this will really put a button tie in that, and we can get practical.
Great.
Which I love doing at the end of something, is actually, how do we live this out?
Yeah, because I love philosophy. I love thinking about these things. I always, at the end of a conversation or at the end of a thought process, I come back to like, well, how can I put this into practice?
Yes.
Yeah.
How can we land the plane? Absolutely. So the parable I was going to tell, this is a parable I've been telling for 20 years, but and there's a lot of Jewish parables that are similar to this, but it's a parable of two rabbis. You may have heard me tell this. Two rabbis who are arguing over some passages in the Torah, and they can't come to agreement about what they mean. And they've been arguing for years, like 10 years, about what these passages mean. Every week, sitting in the park, fighting it out. God, who's got the patience of a saint, eventually goes, I can't take this anymore, can't stand it. I'm going to go down, I'm going to tell them what these passages mean and stop this argument. So God parts the clouds, comes down to the two rabbis, says, I've listened to you guys argue for a decade over these passages. I'll tell you what they mean. And in a rare moment of unity, the two rabbis turn to God and say, what right have you to come down from heaven? You clear off and let us argue about it, right? And God withdraws with a smile, right? So this structure is very similar, and there's a number of Jewish parables like this. So what does it mean? Well, we can think of God as a symbol of happiness, as a symbol of oneness, contentment, going to bring an end to the contradiction that these two rabbis are feeling because they're arguing, right? The Torah is a symbolic, what's called a chain of signifiers in psychoanalysis, but it's language. And it's the language you were born into. So these are rabbis. They were born Jewish. They're born into this language that's expressed in the Torah. So that is how they express themselves and express their world. So that the Torah is the language that you're born into, just like your children have been born into a language and a type of world that you've provided for them. And then the two rabbis can be seen to be a symbol of the subject, the individual, right? And the subject is at war with itself, right? This is what the unconscious is, right? We have our language, whatever language we're given, has contradictions, and we have different interpretations. And the funny thing about the unconscious, it's very important, is people think the unconscious is deep down within us. You go down in the unconscious and you find it. But the Freudian unconscious is what exists on the surface in your speech without you realizing. If I give you advice about something, and what I'm really doing is giving myself advice, but I don't know it. I think I'm giving you advice, but within the language, you should, like a really good example is I'm telling you should break up with that person. You should walk away. You shouldn't be with them, right? But then you know that I'm actually very unhappy in my work at the moment. And then what you're hearing is, I want to walk away from my work. I want to break up with my boss. I want to go off and do something else. And so there's two subjects. There's a subject of the speech, who I'm telling you should split up with that person. And there's another subject that isn't an I, that is saying that, like, I'm unhappy in my work. So we are these contradictions. Happiness comes in to get rid of the contradiction. So God comes in to get rid of the contradiction. The two rabbis resist the romantic relationship, the happiness, the oneness, the wholeness, in favor of religion, in favor of the contradictory symbolic network. Now, here's the interesting about Christianity, which I find fascinating. Hegel's notion of Christianity, forget about belief in God or anything like that, is the Advent, I know Christmas, actually we're coming up to Christmas, but also the Easter, are about monstrosities. The monstrositous notion of the infinite and the finite linking together in the finite. Remember, dialectics always chooses the worst, right? That which cannot die into the dying flesh, right? The highest and the lowest meeting together. That's what Hegel calls the monstrosity of Christ. Christ crucified, God dying. Now, symbolically, that's basically a way of saying that you think God is the whole and complete thing. God is without lack. And then on the crucifixion, you realize that God experiences the death of God. So, God is dead, Nietzsche is dead, God is dead, God, right? That's the Christological answer, right? Yeah. And then you symbolically embrace that. So in other words, we want to be like God, lacking the lack. Then God experiences the lack, and therefore we confront our own lack, and that's salvation. Salvation that's why, very quickly, that's why in the Garden of Eden, right, you've got the fruit tree, you've got Adam and Eve, you've got the serpent, and you've got this prohibition: don't eat of the fruit tree or but the superego says, the serpent said, eat of the fruit and you'll be like God. You'll lack the lack. You'll be whole and complete. Adam and Eve break through the prohibition, just like Oedipus kills the father.
Mm-hmm.
Eat the fruit, just like Oedipus sleeps with the mother. It's a disaster. The temple is a recreation of the Garden of Eden, the Holy of Holies, right, where the absolute dwells.
Yeah.
The curtain, the prohibition, and the court of Gentiles where you can all hang out. What is the crucifixion but the tearing of the temple and the realization that nothing exists that will satisfy you? There's nothing in the Holy of Holies. You can see inside, there's nothing there. That's the nihilistic moment of conversion. That's the death of God. And then in embracing that, you enter into resurrection, where in the work of love and the struggle of sacrifice and gift, God is there in the collective. So all of this to say, and there's so much more we could say about.
I know.
All of this to say, it's great to live in a world where you're free to pursue what will make you happy, right? That's nothing wrong with that. But we need places where we are freed from the pursuit of what will make us happy, right? Deserts in the oasis. And this is what I think church at its best is: a place where you're freed not to try to quieten the contradiction that you are, the argument that you are, the two rabbis that you are, but rather to realize that argument within you is productive. So for the rabbis, it's productive of friendship. They argue for 10 years every week, so they love each other. They productive of knowledge. The more they argue, the more they learn. And productive of their vocation. They become better rabbis, better speakers as a result of the argumentation. That the contradiction is what's productive. And so the whole point of Christ crucified for me is that is the name for the ultimate realization that reality itself is not at one with itself. But by the way, just very quickly, there's loads of names for this.
Yeah.
Right? In biology, the name is evolution. Evolution is the name of the non-at-oneness of biological organisms with themselves that is generative. In mathematics, it's called incompleteness, the idea that mathematics is generated by its own inconsistencies. In physics, it's called, quantum indeterminacy, right? Where we have particle duality, superpositioning. In politics, it's called democracy. Democracy is the non-at-oneness of the social body that creates productive events. In psychoanalysis, it's called the unconscious, which is the destabilizing force of the subject who is not at one with themselves in a potentially productive way. And then in Christianity, it's salvation. It's Christ crucified.
Oh, dude, that's fantastic, and actually really helpful, because I think for a lot of people going through this thing that I've been talking about, like, it does feel like it's a binary choice, faith, doubt, belief, unbelief, certainty, uncertainty, and well, maybe that last one, maybe uncertainty is the thing, right? It's like...
Oh, no, but the certainty and uncertainty, the funny thing is a lot of people think that I'm all about uncertainty, but actually, no. It's like the uncertainty is in its own form, again, dialectically leads to... So I am not... This is the difference between Kant and Hegel. I'm Hegelian, not Kantian. Kant wants to say there's certain things you can't know.
Yeah.
Hegel wants to say not knowing is a type of knowing. In other words, right, you can't know the universe. Not because there's something you don't know. There's lots of things we don't know, but also because the universe doesn't know itself. There is a quantum indeterminacy that's part of reality itself, and that's the generative dimension.
Yeah,
of it.
and you touched on it a minute ago, but in any practice, if you go deep enough, you do seem to find things that don't make sense at previous levels.
Yes,
so you find contradictions. I mean, our understanding of almost anything at a certain level creates rules and ways of understanding them, and then you go deeper and you find those rules almost always get broken.
Yes.
So, but it's sort of a transcend and include situation, because it's like Newtonian physics, for example, like when that was the way of understanding physical motion and physical objects for a long time. But then Einstein came around and was like, no, actually it's like, that's incomplete. There's all these other things to think about. And Newtonian physics didn't stop being true. It just became nested in a greater understanding of reality. And
exactly, yeah.
And it seems like what you're touching on is that you go deep enough into anything and you experience that same thing.
That's it. It's that Hegel has, and it's slightly different from, but spiral dynamics is quite interesting actually. But Hegel's point, which is fascinating, is that there's a consciousness and an object, and these are like ultimately he's going to discover or show that they're interlinked. But I'm always conscious of something. But then as I look at the object, I realize the object has a type of contradiction in it. And as I look at the contradiction in the object, it changes my consciousness. And as that happens, the object changes. And so Hegel has this weird thing where the more you just encounter the contradictions in whatever sphere you're in your relationships, in life and religion, as you confront those and really take them on board, that mere acknowledgement and recognition moves things to a deeper and deeper dimension. And ultimately, Hegel calls this absolute knowledge, where you follow this path long enough. You're always trying to overcome contradiction. You're always trying to quieten that thing, and you go deeper and deeper. And then the ultimate trick is when you realize that then contradiction is the driving truth of reality itself. So you're always trying to overcome contradiction at every step. And then you realize, oh, it's contradiction that's eternal. It's contradiction that actually is at the heart of being itself. So it's a kind of the one. It's not that there's one or there's two. That's the big debate. Is everything one or is everything two or multiple? Mm-hmm. It's everything is less than one or more than one. Everything is one at war with itself. Mm-hmm. At the kind of the oscillation of reality. And here's the key: is that what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, it ultimately looks like the point at which you can hear the ambivalence within your life and in your world, and you can find a way to render that productive. It's where all of the meat of life is. Is like we think, like the child thinks that all of the pleasure and meaning is in getting the present at Christmas. Mm-hmm. They don't realize that it's all in the wait, right? Yeah. The actual opening of the present can be fun, but it kind of passes very quickly. But not having creates joy. Mm. Enjoyment is the pleasure of not getting. Happiness is kind of the pleasure of getting. And joy is a theological concept of getting pleasure from the struggle of life and the struggle of your being. And when you can because that's always true, even when we just can't enjoy our enjoyment, right? Within our current system, we're always fantasizing that if we work hard enough, make enough money, we can retire by the beach, then we'll be happy. But we don't realize that any happiness we're getting is in the struggle itself. We're just not enjoying the enjoyment, and we're maybe doing a job that's alienating. And so the best thing is not to get to retirement, but to find a way to enjoy your struggle and your creativity. Find a project that you'll never complete, but you enjoy the failure. You enjoy the repetition of the failure to complete.
That's beautiful and awesome. And I feel like that's a great place, a great practical place to leave this conversation. So, dude, thank you for sharing these insights and your ideas, and you know, all your reading that you've years and years and years of condensing all these ideas. and I really appreciate you taking the time. And is there?
Well, thanks. So we're really pleased to be on this. Hopefully we'll be able to do this again. And when you're in LA, come up to LA. We'll do this in person. I really
love to do something in person. And you know, I do film work, and I've noticed that you have been doing some really beautiful work. Did you go back to Ireland recently?
Yeah. I went back to Ireland. Yeah, so we need to. Yeah, definitely, we need to chat about that.
Well, I was gonna say, I just really believe in what you're doing, and if there's ever anything I can do to help, that
could be a really interesting collaboration. Yeah. So let's talk about that as well.
But for people that are watching or listening to this, if they want to know more about you, and I mean, you've written, what is it, 9 books?
I know 7. I think
okay.
Maybe 8 books. 8? I think
I mean, look up Peter's books. They're brilliant. but also where else can people learn more about you and maybe also support what you do?
Yeah, well, there's loads of free stuff there online. You go to my YouTube channel. There's loads of lectures and seminars and clips. There's stuff on my website. And then, yeah, if this takes an interest, I also then run book studies and courses, and you can find all that out on Patreon. But lots of free stuff out there. Check out, I guess, the YouTube channel first, or my podcast with my comedian friend called The Fundamentalists.
Yeah, which is brilliant. I've listened to quite a few of those. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Peter. Really appreciate it, man.
Cheers.
Okay, so that was my conversation with Peter Rollins. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching and listening. And as you know, every week we highlight a different nonprofit as a way of making sure that we're not just self-serving here, that we're orienting ourselves toward doing some good in the world and making that a part of this whole thing. So this week, the nonprofit of the week is called Doctors Without Borders, and it's an organization that works to provide specifically medical relief to people that need it all over the world. With coronavirus being such a huge issue in our, on our planet right now, I know that here in America, everything in the news is very, very, very focused on how COVID is affecting Americans, and that's appropriate. But it's also appropriate to remember that this is not something that's only affecting the United States. This is something that's global, and there are many countries that are experiencing coronavirus-related problems and structural problems and infrastructure problems on top of dealing with the coronavirus that we're also dealing with. And Doctors Without Borders is a fantastic organization that is doing great work in getting medical treatment to people that really need it in places where they might not otherwise get it. So check out Doctors Without Borders. Links will be in the show description for the podcast and also in the description of the YouTube video down below. Guys, thank you so much for joining me for another week. Love you guys. Stay safe and stay curious.